Unit 4? 2. Just checking to see if you're still awake, because it's getting late. It's getting late for us too. So we are going to do some introductions. We're going to read the question and then we'll get started. I suspect you know the drill already. All right, my name is Jack Barlow and I teach politics at Juniata College in Pennsylvania.
I'm Lester Brooks. I teach history at Anne Arundel Community College in Arnold, Maryland.
Drummond, I teach political science, Black Hills State University in South Dakota.
And you are?
Good evening, we are Reno High's Unit 2. I'm Isaac Williams and I will be attending Bates College.
I'm Julie Cardinale and I'll be attending the University of California.
I'm Alex Newman, I'll be attending the University of Michigan.
I'm Allison Connors and I will be attending Seattle University. Our unit coach is Mr. Sam Macaluso and our teacher is Mr. Richard Clark.
Good. So they're here. The town crier.
Can't see.
You have to have a projecting voice in order to do what you do, I'm sure.
Yes.
And thank you for your late hours. Thank you for all the things that you have done to get these students ready to come. So from behind the scenes, you've done a great job. Thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. So, the question for today is question 1. Yes, question 1. So I will read it and we will get started. The state constitution developed in Pennsylvania in 1776 was considered the most democratic of the state constitutions, and it provoked considerable controversy. Quote, working for 8 weeks, the constitution drafters considered and then rejected 3 of the most honored elements of English Republican thought, says Gary Nash. What elements did they reject when writing the Pennsylvania Constitution, and what were their reasons for doing so? What are the advantages and disadvantages of a unicameral legislature? Which do you prefer, presumably unicameral or bicameral, as opposed to advantages rather than disadvantages? And on which fundamental democratic values and principles or other interests is your opinion based? What impact, if any, did the Pennsylvania Constitution have on the U.S. Constitution? Begin.
The Pennsylvania motto reads, virtue, liberty, and independence. Virtue ensures righteousness. Liberty prevents oppression, and independence promotes self-sufficiency. The writers of the Pennsylvania Constitution understood the power behind each word. Thus, they discarded 3 highly recognized ideals, and in doing so, promoted the ideas of virtue, liberty, and independence.
Virtue shows high moral standards. The writers showed virtue when scrapping a 2-house legislature, arguing all people be represented more thoroughly and the interests of the commoner be supported. In 1764, the British Parliament passed the Currency Act, prohibiting colonies from establishing coin. Colonists were left with worthless currencies and a distaste for the wealthy's power. Pennsylvania's General Assembly curbed this, showing high moral standards.
Liberty is the state of being free from oppressive restrictions. The Pennsylvania Constitution rejected the idea of an independent executive branch with extensive powers, promoting the liberty of Pennsylvania citizens. The writers feared an overbearing executive. They ensured the president could not amend or veto laws. Section 20 of the Pennsylvania Constitution brought power to the people, stating, the president and vice president shall be chosen annually.
Independence allows for control of one's own life. By scrapping franchises that kept voting available only to free, white, property-owning males, the writers promoted self-control. The writers agreed with jurist James Sullivan, saying, every member of society has the right to give consent to the laws of the community. Seeking obedience of elected officials, sections 10 and 40 of the Pennsylvania Constitution outline oaths of affirmation. Section 10 says officials shall do nothing injurious to the people, thus protecting voters and their independence.
William Patterson realized unicameral legislatures promoted independence through enacting legislation faster and reducing costs for the government. He implemented this in his New Jersey plan. If the Senate were removed in Nevada, the state would save $750,000 in compensation alone. Unicameral legislatures enact sovereignty through their ability to make decisions without a second chamber.
However, the disadvantages are a limited minority, endangered liberty, and influence from lobbyists. In 2015, Nebraska's unicameral legislature was influenced by $15.6 million from special interest groups, according to a government analysis by watchdog group Common Cause Nebraska. The 11% increase was intended to influence legislation. Bicameral legislatures can better protect the rights and interests of minorities. Without a second chamber, liberty risks being reversed.
I argue federal government should be bicameral and states unicameral. Canada employs this idea, providing a counterbalance to the tyranny of the majority at the federal level, while provincial governments focus on issues of local significance, promoting the principle of checks and balances.
However, the rest of us support a bicameral legislature on both levels.
The citizens of Morocco voted in 1996 to add another chamber, the House of Councillors. 108 members are appointed to represent industry, agriculture, and trade unions. This promotes the principle of representative government.
Federalist 51 argues the legislative authority predominates, and the remedy for this is to divide the legislature. Bicameral legislatures promote the principle of checks and balances with consent in both houses, keeping away from a dominating group and establishing protection from tyranny.
The Pennsylvania Constitution impacted the U.S. Constitution, implementing a sense of virtue. Constitutional author M.J.C. Weil noted, the Pennsylvania Constitution failed to distinguish between the separation of powers and checks and balances. This was a problem that piqued the framers' interest and was resolved in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the U.S. Constitution. The Pennsylvania Constitution was also implemented into Article 1, Sections 2 and 8, and the Supremacy Clause.
Additionally, Section 9 of the Pennsylvania Constitution established the legislature shall have no power to add, alter, abolish, or infringe upon any part of this Constitution. And Section 17 established proportional representation. These ideas worked virtuously to shape the U.S. Constitution.
Virtue, liberty, and independence all act in unison. The writers of the Pennsylvania Constitution understood these ideas were what outlined a successful government. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So, one of the things you talked about was the effect of money on politics. Do you think that the current system of campaign finance has enhanced or has undermined our system, our bicameral system in the United States?
It has undermined our bicameral system. In a speech from President Jimmy Carter, he compared the Senate to an oligarchy because it's influenced by political bribery. The cases of Buckley v. Vallejo and Citizens United have influenced how large billionaires can spend their money to influence candidates, which has been more represented in the Senate because the senators are representing the billionaires and not the states.
In addition, with the Senate, ever since the passing of the 17th Amendment, taking away Senate elections away from the state legislatures, candidates now have to campaign in states requiring expensive elections, and just they need many funds from special interest groups and lobbyists, taken away from the principle of bicameralism.
Let me talk a little bit about this Pennsylvania Constitution seems to want more democracy. And why? That would be my question. Why would they want more democracy when certainly there were plenty of examples that suggest that you don't trust the people? Madison, Men Are Not Angels, Benjamin Rush, a fear of a mobocracy. So why? Why more democracy?
Well, the Pennsylvania Constitution, the main difference between different republics and democracies in the past and its voting rights was the fact that it gave voting rights to tax-paying males, which it wasn't a pure democracy in this sense, but these new tax-paying males were direct contributors to the Pennsylvania government, and thus they gave them these rights.
Additionally, you mentioned James Madison and his quote on men not being angels. However, in Federalist 51, he's in a sense regarding those men as the ones that are serving the government. And so I would argue that the Pennsylvania Constitution noted that the men within government are not angels, and the people should serve as an additional check on these people, on the government itself. And so the people serve as an additional check to the government.
No taxation without representation. This was the motto that influenced people in the colonists to go against the British government because they weren't being fairly represented in their government. So the writers of the Pennsylvania Constitution wanted to increase democracy because they weren't being represented in the former English government.
Do you trust the people? Certainly there were questions then about trusting the people, certainly because of the Electoral College, but what about now? Do you trust the American people now?
Yes, in our state of Nevada, it's actually required through Article 4 of our state constitution that any amendment to our state constitution needs to be through voter referendum, which in this sense is giving trust power to the people and the fact that we can trust ourselves to govern our own, or to create our own amendments to our legislation, which happened recently with the addition of Marsy's Law to our state constitution.
I actually disagree with my colleague Julie because over time, in the last 40 years, there's been a 21% decrease in civic participation within government, and that includes voting, participating in democratic groups and things, and there's been a very huge loss of participation within schools themselves because of the invention of so much technology, cars, and faraway neighborhoods from work that people have become less involved within their own communities and they do not participate in local nor federal government.
James Madison drew from Cicero's idea that direct democracy can become tyrannical, which is why he advocated for a Republican government, where the people could elect representatives to vote on issues and take away from the influence of mob rule.
While my colleague Allison's points definitely are valid and there has been a significant decrease, programs such as the We the People program and other civic activism programs definitely will help the American public trust the people.
Okay, thank you.
Alex, lone voice in the wilderness. You want unicameral legislature at the state level. This is an answer, our question any of you can answer. What's the reason for that? Convince me that it's a good idea.
Article 1, Section 3 says that states will have power in the Senate and the people will have power in the House. However, since the Baker v. Carr decision, the districts and states are elected or are proportional to the people and not representative of special state, like of smaller interest groups like the states. So the people are being represented in bicameral systems in the state assembly and the Senate, thus it is not needed.
Additionally, while I don't agree with my colleague Alex, 59% of the world is a unicameral system, and this is because a lot of the countries are smaller than the US, and so on a smaller scale, unicameralism can work very effectively because there's less interest groups to uphold and there's not as many people to have to represent.
I also don't agree with my colleague Alex, but it's important to note that unicameral legislatures do get legislation passed at a much more expedited rate. Recently in Nebraska, the only state with a unicameral legislature, there was mass floodings, and with this unicameral legislature, legislation was being able to pass much more rapidly without dissent from another chamber.
So you talked about separation of powers and checks and balances, and that Pennsylvania Constitution failed to separate them. Can you unpack that a little bit? Tell me a little bit more about how they would have separated, or they should have separated.
Well, one example is with the unicameral legislature because that does provide an opportunity for tyrannical cases to arise, and this has actually been seen with Nebraska's unicameral legislature because in 1972 they passed the Equal Rights Amendment unanimously. However, later in 1973 on March 15th, 3 months after having a new election of senators, they withdrew that, and they withdrew that, and it shows that that overturn can really become corrupt because of the change in that one house system.
Okay, thank you. You made a bold move in the opening statement. You started out with the Pennsylvania flag, and I thought, okay, they're going to limit themselves because of the flag, but you didn't do that. So that was a very good thing. You brought up a number of things that I think some, maybe all of the previous teams have not done. You talked about, well, the 1764 Currency Act, the Nebraska experience with contributions, campaign contributions. I'd love to hear more about that, right? The use of money to influence the way that the state legislature thinks. And yeah, should we make it cheaper for them, right? By having just one house? Maybe not. Right? Make it expensive and hard. So I think you raised some really fascinating questions. And yeah, so I thought that was, I mean, it shows that you've been thinking about it. You started me thinking about it, even though it's, late. And I think that's a very good thing. That is essential to having our government be a decent government going forward. So thank you for doing that, and keep doing it, please. All right.
I like the introduction. You were able to weave that in, virtue, liberty, independence, and you sort of made it relevant. You tied it to what was going on before. You showed us the history and what led up to the changes that Pennsylvania wanted to make. And then you had a number of issues that were interesting, how the Pennsylvania Constitution influenced the U.S. government, the need for separation of powers. You showed a deep understanding. You were actually thinking about these things. And there was some energy here. I felt some energy behind it, where it's not just something that you have to do. You are legitimately interested in the material. And I like the fact that you disagreed, again, showing an independence of thought. And so, good job.
Opening remarks, I thought you covered a lot of ground, a lot of information presented, but you did so in a very organized way. I thought we got something out of that, so well done. Q&A, you seem to think very well on your feet, and you worked well as a team, so that helped you shine. One critique I have is maybe just slow things down a bit in your responses. You have a lot to say, you want to say, but we're not quite as quick as you, so just slow it down a bit. Overall, well done.
Thank you.